Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this new lecture in our program on American literature. My name is Fuzi Slisli and this is our lecture number 9. Today we're looking at modernism, the movement, the literary and artistic movement modernism, and we're looking at a short story by Chopin, The Story of an Hour. Let's talk a little bit about modernism. Modernism is a movement that appeared in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The two great wars, the First World War and the Second World War, had a great deal of influence on ways of approaching the world, thinking about the world and about human life. Two world wars in the span of a generation effectively shocked Western civilization. Modernism is characterized by a sudden and unexpected breaks with traditional ways of viewing and interacting with the world, right? So there is a sudden and unexpected breaks with traditional ways of viewing and interacting with the world. Modernism uses experimentation and individualism. A central preoccupation of modernism is with the inner self and with consciousness, right? They kind of focus on the inside, not on the outside. In contrast to the romantic worldview, the modernist cares rather little for nature. Modernism doesn't care much for nature, for being, or the overarching structures of history. Instead of progress and growth, the modernist intelligentsia sees decay, destruction, and a growing alienation of the individual. The machinery of modern society is perceived as impersonal, capitalist, and antagonistic to the artistic impulse. Modernist fiction spoke of the inner self and of consciousness, right? Again, they focus on the inside, not the outside. Instead of progress, modernist writers saw a decline of civilization. Instead of new technology, modernist writers saw cold machinery and increased capitalism, which alienated the individual and led to loneliness and alienation. To achieve the emotions described above, most modernist fiction was cast in the first person. They like using the first-person narration, or first-person in general, not just in literature, but across the arts. Whereas earlier, most literature had a clear beginning, middle, and end, or introduction, conflict, and resolution, a modernist story or a modernist narrative was often more of a stream of consciousness. Irony, satire, and comparisons were often employed to point out society's ills. For the first time, modernist reader, this can all add up to feel like the story is going nowhere, right? You have this feeling when you read modernist stories that the story isn't going anywhere, right? And that's precisely what they want to convey, that humanity isn't going anywhere. It's just turning in destructive circles, right? And the future is hopeless. Let me give you a short list of some famous modernist writers. The most famous names include Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, Joseph Conrad, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, E.E. Cummings, Sylvia Plath, Scott Fitzgerald, William Butler Yeats, Ezra Pound, of course, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, and Gertrude Stein, and many, many, many others. So, what are the characteristics of modernist literature? I'm going to give you a short list of some of the most common characteristics of modernism in fiction or in literature. The first one, there is a destabilization and fragmentation of reality. There is realistic details with symbolic, suggestive, allegorical twists. We also find narration through fragmented, internalized, or multiple perspectives or viewpoints. The use of stream of consciousness as a technique. Non-linear time. Modernism does not use linear time. Time in modernist literature is non-linear, or other distortions of time and conventions. Allusiveness, right? There's a lot of allusions, symbolic references to or self-conscious intertextuality with prior literary texts or biblical texts or religious texts, so there is a lot of allusiveness. And there is also self-consciousness and irony concerning literary and social conventions. So this is in brief some of the most common characteristics of modernist writing. I want to look now at a modernist text. We have selected The Story of an Hour by Chopin. Let's talk a little bit about the historical background. The 19th century, like several centuries before it, was a time of privilege for wealthy Caucasian males. Women, minorities, and the poor were marginalized to the point of utter silence and inconsequence, right? It was a complete, total dominance of wealthy white males. So women, minorities, and the poor were marginalized to the point of utter silence and inconsequence. The 20th century witnessed the beginnings of a new paradigm between first the sexes, between males and females, and later between different cultural groups, blacks and browns. And class distinction remains arguably the most difficult bridge to cross in terms of forming a truly equitable society. As the 20th century moved forward, a greater variety of literary voices won the struggle to be heard. What had so recently been inconceivable was steadily becoming a reality. Those voices that were voiceless before are now finding a voice. Chopin was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1850. She was one of 5 children, but the only one to live through her 20s. Her father, Thomas O'Flaherty, died when she was 5, and she spent her childhood among women. Her mother, Eliza, grandmother, great-grandmother, and the nuns who ran her school. In 1870, Chopin married Oscar Chopin and moved with him to New Orleans, where they had 6 children. Chopin was an independent spirit who smoked cigarettes, walked alone through the city, and argued passionately with others about politics and social problems, much to the dismay of the New Orleans housewives in her social circle, because for them that was scandalous. Not long after the family moved to Clouterville, Louisiana, Oscar died unexpectedly. Chopin mourned his death deeply, but eventually embraced her independence, even going so far as having an affair with a married man. Chopin soon returned to St. Louis, where she would spend the rest of her life. The Story of an Hour is a story by Chopin, an American novel, is a mainstay of feminist literary studies. Originally published in 1894, the story documents the complicated reaction of Louise Mallard upon learning of her husband's death. That's the main event in the story. The character Louise Mallard has a complicated reaction to the news of her husband's death. Let's talk about the title a little bit. The Story of an Hour. There's a reference to time in the title. And there's two aspects to this reference. There's the word an hour and the word story. Let's look at hour first. The radical events take place in a span of an hour. The whole story takes place in the span of an hour to maximize the tragic effects of the events. First, there is a false death of Mr. Mallard, and then the real death of Mrs. Mallard, right? Take place so quickly and suddenly in a matter of an hour. So there is the false death of the husband, and then there is the real death of the wife. And both of them take place so quickly and suddenly in a matter of 1 hour. However, in Mrs. Mallard's case, processing the tragic news of her husband's death and what it means for the shape of her life makes that hour slow way down and stand still. Mrs. Mallard spends less than an hour processing the news that her husband has died. In doing so, she moves rapidly through her grief to arrive at a dream or a story of what life by herself will look like. In less than an hour, she got used to the idea of a whole different future, a future she's excited about, instead of a future that she dreads and fears. But the work of a few seconds, seeing her husband alive and well, because it was a false news, he didn't die, so when he shows up again, right, those few seconds proves her wrong and blows up that new dream of a possible future path. The story shows that time is subjective and can move in different paces. While an hour isn't much for most people, for Mrs. Mallard, in that particular day, 1 hour was life-altering, was life-changing. Let's look at the word a story in the title. The Story of an Hour. This literary work is both a story and a story. It's a story Kate Chopin wrote and the story Mrs. Mallard lives, right? In the title, story both describes the form of the tale, it's a short story that Chopin is telling about Mrs. Mallard, as well as the story of Mrs. Mallard, that Mrs. Mallard tells herself about the potential her life can hold once her husband dies. In the Story of an Hour, Chopin employs specific structural and stylistic techniques to heighten the drama of the hour. The structure Chopin has chosen for the Story of an Hour fits the subject matter perfectly. The story is short, made up of a series of short paragraphs, many of which consist of just 2 or 3 sentences. Likewise, the story covers only 1 hour in Louise Mallard's life, from the moment she learns of her husband's death to the moment he unexpectedly returns alive. The short, dense structure mirrors the intense hour Louise spends contemplating her new independence, just as Louise is completely immersed in her wild thoughts of the moment. We are immersed along with her in this brief period of time. This story can be read quickly, but the impact it makes is powerful. Chopin surprises us first with Louise's elated reaction, her happiness, when she first murmurs, "free," to herself. she shocks us again at the conclusion when she dies upon her husband's return. The heart disease mentioned at the end of the story echoes the heart trouble discussed at the beginning of the story, intensifying the twist ending and bringing the story to a satisfying close. Let's talk a little bit about the style. Because such a short story leaves no room for background information, for flashbacks, or excessive speculation, Chopin succeeds in making every sentence important by employing an almost poetic writing style. She uses repetition to highlight important points, such as when she repeats the word open throughout the story to emphasize the freedom of Louise's new life. It's like, it's open. She has Louise repeat the word free over and over again as well, which is one of the few words Louise actually speaks aloud in the story and indicates how much she cherishes her newfound freedom. Besides repeating words, Chopin also repeats phrases and sentence structures to highlight important points. For example, Chopin writes, "She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long." So yesterday, she was scared that life might be long. It's painful. But now, right, she breathed a quick prayer. She's praying that life might be long because she feels she'll be free and happy. The identical phrasing of the second half of each sentence reveals how drastically Louise's life had changed. She once shuddered at the thought of a long life, but now she prays for it. Finally, Chopin makes the process of the story beautiful by using alliteration and internal rhymes. For example, Josephine reveals in Half Concealing when she tells Louise the news and Bentley reappears composedly carrying his belongings. All of Chopin's stylistic and structural techniques combine to make this very short story powerful. Let me talk a little bit about the symbolism. Mrs. Mallard's heart trouble, first of all. The heart trouble that afflicts Louise is both a physical and symbolic malady that represents her ambivalence towards her marriage and unhappiness with her lack of freedom. We can see this uneasiness of love in her confession that she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not, which further reinforces the symbolic meaning of Mrs. Mallard's heart condition. The fact that Louise has heart trouble is the first thing we learn about her, and this heart trouble is what seems to make the announcement of Bentley's death so threatening. When Louise reflects on her new independence, her heart races, pumping blood through her veins. When she dies at the end of the story, the diagnosis of heart disease seems appropriate because the shock of seeing her husband was surely enough to kill her. But the doctor's conclusion that she had died of overwhelming joy, overwhelming happiness, is ironic because it had been the loss of joy that had actually killed her. Indeed, Louise seems to have died of a broken heart caused by the sudden loss of her independence. Another important symbol in the story is the open window, from which Louise gazes for much of the story. It represents the freedom and opportunities that await her after her husband has died. From the window, Louise sees blue sky, fluffy clouds, and treetops. She hears people and birds singing and smells a coming rainstorm. Everything that she experiences through her senses suggests joy and spring. suggests a new life. And when she ponders the sky, she feels the first hints of elation. Once she fully indulges in this excitement, she feels that the open window is providing her with life itself. The open window provides a clear, bright view into the distance and Louise's own bright future, which is now unobstructed by the demands of another person, i.e. her husband. It's therefore no coincidence that when Louise turns from the window and the view, she quickly loses her freedom as well. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. This quotation captures the transformation of personality and perception that happened to Mrs. Mullard. This quotation appears close to the end of the story, just before Louise leaves her bedroom to go back downstairs, and illuminates the extent of Louise's elation. Before Brantley's death, Louise viewed her life with trepidation, envisioning years of dull, unchanging dependence and oppression. The shudder she felt was one of dread. Now, however, she is free and independent, and her life is suddenly worth living. Whereas she once hoped life would be short, she now prays for a long, happy life. This passage, besides showing us how fully Louise feels her independence, also highlights the unexpectedness of Louise's reaction. Rather than dread a life lived alone, this solitude is, for Louise, reason enough to anticipate the future eagerly. When Brantley returns, she dies, unable to face the return of the life that she had dreaded so much. Irony, the idea that Louise died of a joy that kills, that her joy, her happiness that her husband returned, is what killed her. When Mr. Mullard enters the house alive and well, in the final scene, his appearance is utterly ordinary. He is a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. His mundane appearance contrasts greatly with Louise's feverish triumph, and her walking down the stairs like a goddess of victory. When the doctors determine that Louise died of heart disease, of joy that kills, the reader immediately recognizes the irony. It seems clear that her shock was not joy over her husband's survival, but rather distress over losing her cherished newfound freedom. Louise did briefly experience joy, the joy of imagining herself in control of her own life, and it was the removal of that intense joy that led to her death. It was not a joy that kills. An important theme in the story is marriage. Chopin suggests that all marriages, even the kindest one, are inherently oppressive. Louise, who readily admits that her husband was kind and loving, nonetheless feels joy when she believes that he has died. Her reaction doesn't suggest any malice, and Louise knows that she'll cry at Brantley's funeral. However, despite the love between husband and wife, Louise views Brantley's death as a release from her oppression. She never names a specific way in which Brantley oppressed her, hinting instead that marriage in general stifles both women and men. She even seems to suggest that she oppressed Brantley just as much as he oppressed her. Louise's epiphany, in which these thoughts parade through her mind, reveals the inherent oppressiveness of all marriages, which by their nature rob people of their independence. Freedom and death. Freedom comes to Mrs. Mullard in the form of death, which makes it terrifying. At first she receives the news of her dead husband which she recognizes as her own freedom. However, as she sees her husband alive, her dream of freedom and independence is shattered. So, gains another type of freedom through her own death. It seems as if Mrs. Mullard's freedom as a woman is only possible through death. The death of her husband, which is a bleak and perhaps realistic perception of freedom in that time period. However, as soon as she sees her living husband, the freedom that she thought she owned was taken away from her. Mrs. Mullard was not able to let go of her dream of freedom, so she seeks another type of freedom, freedom from the constrictions of life itself. Therefore, although it is not explicitly mentioned in the story, it can be argued that Mrs. Mullard eventually got her freedom through death, but this time her own. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story and enjoyed being introduced to modernism in literature. Until the next session, I see you. Have a wonderful day, and Salam alaikum.